Swordplay has been at the heart of fiction for as long as modern stories have been told. The clashing of blades signifies more than just physical combat. It represents a conflict of ideals, old versus new, good versus evil, right versus wrong. You can read about it in books, see it in movies, and even the sound is distinctive. But how does that translate into fighting games? In doing my research, I noticed that developers seemed hesitant to include characters with swords into their fighting games. The focus was on hand-to-hand combat after all, so a sword would just seem silly. But then, one game sought to really push that boundary. This is World Heroes, an arcade fighting game published by SNK in 1992, the same year as Capcom's genre-defining Street Fighter II Champion Edition. World Heroes featured characters based off of legendary warriors from different time and places in history. Iconically, a good bit of them brandished and wielded weapons in battle as well. As far as I can tell in fighting game history, this is one of, if not the first fighting game to feature sword characters. Swords in fighting games are an interesting case study, in that for games based around some form of hand-to-hand martial art, you have to essentially imagine the blade is dulled, since a few slashes from a blade are obviously more effective than blows from fists. In exchange, swords can have longer reach and sometimes do big damage depending on the kind of attack. The depictions aren't always the same though, as there's tons of ways to portray how different kinds of swords would fight in a fighting game. For videos I've done in the past, characters would normally fall into categories that are different because of how an overall idea in games was designed. This could be how they're controlled or the different kinds of stances they might take. But for sword fighters, they can be grouped relatively easily depending on the style of fighting they practice, or even just the type of sword that they use. It would be insane for me to try to categorize every sword character there is, so I'm gonna focus on 4 types for this video. If you're interested in a part 2, make sure you leave a like and drop a comment on any type of swords or characters you think I might have missed. With that said, the first type I want to mention is the Fencer. Fencers can fight well from range and usually have quick thrusting attacks to keep the opponent at bay. This style usually avoids the large sweeping slashes you'd see in other kinds of swordplay, as those can be easy to deflect and counter if your opponent has the same equipment as you. But in fighting games, that's rarely the case, and the Fencers can get away with more slash-like attacks. Their weight of their weapons often also play into effect with their design. Rapiers and sabers are some of the lightest swords out there, which means the Fencer is usually light on their feet. They float through the air gracefully and move about the stage almost as if they were sliding, which makes sense considering how important footwork is in actual fencing. The sport is about being in the right place at the right time, and losing your balance could cost you the match, or in this case, your life. The parallels between the piste, the stage where fencing bouts are held, and the stages of 2D fighters make fencing look extremely natural in such fantastic settings. The piste is usually 14 meters long and only 1.5 meters wide, so it encourages movement on the X and Y axis while restricting movement along the Z. With this staging and footwork situation, certain stances and moves of fencing naturally made their way into fighting games. Techniques such as the remise became exaggerated to the point where they've become very anime-like and are a flurry of thrusts used to overwhelm the opponent. Other techniques like parries and counter parries can be seen commonly among fencer types as well. Interestingly enough, fencing is more than just a fighting style in fighting games though. It's a way to build certain tropes of a character. In 17th century France, King Louis XIV decided that all French nobility were required to train in the rapier. This is why so many of the modern terms for fencing are in French, but it's also why so many of these character types are of the nobility in some way or another.
It's like we're in an episode of Lifestyles of the Rich and Fabulous.
Mitsuru Kirijo, Marth, Charlotte are all of noble status in one way or another, and therefore it makes sense for them to be trained in the rapier. It's a cool touch that also just makes sense for world building, and it probably makes it easier on the character designers. Either way, fencing's bold and proud history transposes itself into this 2D world wonderfully, and naturally, that makes it one of the more common sword types in fighting games.
I'm sorry.
On the other end of that spectrum, there's the Greatsword users. In fighting games, these characters are usually depicted as heavy, strong, and with towering figures. They're characters who can use raw strength to overpower their opponent. Basically, if they can wield a sword like that, there's no question whether or not they can cut you down. To accentuate this, They also can have heavy armor on their person, which would explain why it takes so much to kill them. Greatswords throughout history were an answer to a very common problem. What do you do when every soldier on a battlefield is wearing armor that can withstand attacks from normal blades? Well, the solutions that were crafted made it so soldiers no longer had to worry about stabbing and laceration, but rather smashing. If you could smash the enemy's skull through their helmet or crack their ribs beneath the chest plate, what need would you have for slashing and cutting? That's the power of a greatsword, and fighting games are pretty good at translating that idea. Greatsword characters play based on momentum. They're not usually quick since their swords are so damn big, but once they get going, it's all about attacking until the opponent's defense is broken. Many characters going this route will have attacks that lead into other more devastating blows to emulate the idea of momentum in their swings and mix up their opponents. The other common thread is the grip change. Greatswords were designed to be offensive powerhouses that doubled as defensive options. Many had long guards to parry attacks, as well as hooks to straight up disarm their opponents, but some also had a second area to grip to warrant quicker strikes at a closer range. This meant the greatsword wielders could flow between close and mid-range fighting much easier than almost any other kind of weapon. The grips change depending on the sword, and with some games you might get something like this. There's something so satisfying about absolutely crushing your opponent that translates especially well to fighting games. It's a feat of strength more than swordsmanship, so among other fighters just using their fists and kicks, it somehow feels like a fairer fight. But maybe that's just me.
Now stand aside, worthy adversary. 'Tis but a scratch.
Shielders are an interesting type of character, as there's those who wield a shield and short sword like a Greek or Roman would, and then there's those who just go off with their shields as a means of weapon and defense. Both are valid. Starting with the more traditional use, we can see short swords and shields used in tandem. This was the standard equipment for a Roman legionary. The shield is called a scutum, and the sword was a gladius. The combination helped soldiers excel in close-range combat, as the weight of the sword and versatility of the shield made them extremely hard to overcome. Leading with the shield means possibly disarming your opponent while deflecting their attacks and leaving them open for quick and accurate strikes. In fighting games, these characters play pretty much the same. They generally want to get in close, and there's two ways of achieving that goal for them. There's the shield throw and the shield bash. Shield bashing in actual combat is incredibly effective, as it can tie up the opponent's weapon while freeing up your own to strike, and in fighting games, it's usually the same. The shield bash attack is almost always a quick start-up attack that can blow through the opponent's offense and defense, opening them up to whatever you want to do. The shield throw is a bit less practical. You'll almost never see it in a real fight because it requires giving up your main defensive option, and shields are usually attached to the arm pretty securely, making it difficult to throw. Fighting games get around this by having the shield naturally be recalled to the player, enhancing its usefulness in the mid to long range. In the vein of shields and usefulness, there's the other type of characters who only use shields as their offense and defense combined. These characters also usually have the shield bash and or shield throw, but their movesets are based around other things. Usually these shields are pretty hefty in size to imply crushing power and defensive absolution. There's not much in the way of real-life applications of this, since shields are paired with something like a spear or a crossbow in real life. That said, the ones in fighting games have a unique style that can wear an opponent down and have them fear gaps in their own pressure, as the tides can turn at any moment. The Way of the Samurai. It's about more than just how to wield a sword. It's about honor, loyalty, and martial arts. These characters follow the code in a way that's ingrained into their character design. Maybe they're a swordsman a few words, or maybe they dress the part. Maybe they're a character with an extra spiritual element, but all of these tie into what it means to be a samurai. Samurai pride themselves with the ability to cut down an opponent in as few strikes as necessary, respecting their blades as a well-refined tool, which translates into strikes with no wasted movement and a sort of rigidity in their stances. These stances are called kamae. Almost every samurai character takes these stances in fighting games as their representative of the style. The stances flow between each other from strikes to defense, allowing for precise movements out of every single one of them. The other very common thing we'll see with these characters is the practice of iaido. Iaido refers to the art of unsheathing your blade. It's what leads to the trope of things like this. Yuzuriha from Under Night is a great example of this that I've talked about in the past, as she's got a stance for unsheathing her sword and unleashing a flurry of faster-than-light attacks. Her fighting style is called Dual Moon's one-blade drawing style, and it's pretty obvious where some of the techniques come from. As the sword fighting style from Japan, there's no question about why we see so many samurai fighters in fighting games. They have been mystified in basically every form of media in Japan, and the tradition has spread to the West as well. These katana-wielding masters symbolize more than just a means to swing a sword. They've become a globally recognizable character archetype that continues to evolve with storytelling. The clashing of ideals in sword combat is something that's been played with a million times and evolved in the process. There's the beam struggles of anime, and some movies have even started to film gunplay with heavy inspirations from how kung fu movies would portray sword fights. Fighting games are no different, implementing similar clashes to pit one player's will against their opponents. But in my opinion, there really isn't anything that can beat a good old-fashioned clashing of blades. That's all for now. If you liked this video, please subscribe and leave a comment about your favorite sword fighter in fighting games. Thanks to everyone who's been supporting the channel up until now, because you guys have really made this a dream come true for me. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.